Thanks for being here. I'm excited to introduce Eric Robertson, an MFA candidate in photography, who will be discussing his exhibition, Interstices, Our Contract with Nature. The exhibition is currently on view at the Gittins Gallery, which is located in the art building on the U's campus. The exhibition can be viewed through May 7th and is open to the public Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Dr. Eric Robertson is a visual artist who uses traditional and digital photographic processes to explore issues related to the intersection of humans and the natural world. Eric's work uses abstractions, interrupted landscapes, images depicting resource exploitation, and focuses on the welfare of non-human animals and non-living things. Eric studied photography at the San Francisco Art Institute until its closure in 2020 and is completing his MFA here at the U. Eric is also a physical therapist and an associate professor at the University of Utah and the University of Southern California, where his work in part explores issues related to environmental physiotherapy and health. Eric lives and works in Salt Lake City, Utah. Please join me in welcoming Eric Robertson.
Thank you, and thanks for everybody who's joining and joining from all different walks of my life, which is exciting. So I wanted to start out with some gratitude, and I'd like to thank my committee for their guidance along the way. And I think they helped me make a pretty long journey in a pretty short amount of time. It was more of an adventure than I realized to switch art schools halfway through. And to that sense, I also want to thank all of the faculty at the University of Utah for permitting the transfer and the non-traditional kind of pathway that happened. But it's been really fun and really good. I also want to thank the first year of my education back to the faculty at San Francisco Art Institute. And I'd like to extend a lot of gratitude to my department here at the U for supporting me in this educational process, even as I have a job that I need to pay attention to at the same time. And then finally, I'd like to thank Mary Derrick and Bryce Billings, who were really helpful with my installation process, which went very smoothly, although took quite a long time. So today what I want to talk about is a little bit of context about me as it relates to the work, and then really dive into this concept of our contract with nature and really talk a little bit about reconciliation with the environment and with nature a little bit, and how I think photography and images can help with that process. So to start about me, I guess I'll start and say that I'm from New Jersey, but I'm not from that New Jersey. I'm from this New Jersey. And this New Jersey was very rural. And my father grew up, both my parents grew up in more of an urban setting, and they moved to the country when I was very young. And so they got horses and did the whole thing and bought a tractor and all these kind of fun things. And, as my father would take me on hikes, it was still very new to him to go explore the landscape around him. And so I could feel that sense of wonder. So it wasn't just going on a hike and this is what you did, here's how you do it. I think it was more like this like wondrous exploration from a very young age. And so I think that's something that stayed with me through my life, is this sense of wonder when I'm looking and exploring nature. Even from when I was very little, I can't remember when, but I have all these memories of photography in my life. So it's sort of maybe an interrupted process here to get to it. But I remember from a very young age being very obsessed with photography. And I guess about 5 years ago, I walked into Looking Glass Photo in Berkeley, and I turned around a corner and there was like an 8x10 view camera, a whole kit just staring me in the face. And it was expensive and it was intimidating, and I had no idea how to use it or how to get the film developed or anything like that. I'd never developed film myself. And so I asked the guy if he would take a ridiculously low price for it, and he said yes. And that process, that buying that view camera, seemed to be, not the only point, but it was a catalyst in me turning to a more serious contemplation of photography and then art. So I would also say that I'm from San Francisco Art Institute, but it broke. But I did have a really formative experience there and enjoyed my instruction very much. And I feel like all of that helps contribute to what I want to really talk about. So I also have this other life, I guess, which I'm a physical therapist, and I've been doing that for a long time. I think I'm almost in my 15th year of academia. And I think it's relevant to this in the sense that physical therapists solve problems in a very unique way. They're rooted in science, and they're data collectors and they're hypothesis testers. And so they go around doing this little clinical science thing. But at the same time, physical therapists create really deep relationships with their patients. It's notable in the healthcare spectrum. And physical therapists are really good listeners. And I think as I've gone through this, I think the progress was made when I decided to not ignore the other side of my life, but sort of embrace the way that I think and solve problems as a physical therapist. So let's go back to my youth for a minute here. This is a screen capture of where I grew up. And I grew up on the New York, New Jersey border in Northwest New Jersey. And you can see my house there is that little red dot on the left. It bordered the Appalachian Trail. So it was really this idyllic land. And when I grew up, the only other house around, the only building structure around was the farm. There was one other house between my house and the farm. So all those things that you see are new. And I'm not sure if that's a solar array over there, but it kind of makes me uncomfortable because it used to be a big cornfield when I was younger. And this is where I would grow up. And I spent a ton of time when I was little down at Toner's farm. I would ride my bike there. We'd go fishing at Toner's pond. I'd go and spend my afternoons at the dairy farm. And probably until I was like 10, I wanted to grow up and be a dairy farmer. And that was my life's ambition. And I would hike there where you saw these panels. I would go up through this long field, and there was a road that took you up here, and you'd come up into this world here. What you can't see from this photo is that it's a really high elevation compared to where my house was. And it was like this protected little area of view up there. Nobody could see you. You couldn't really see away from it, but it was like this great land of exploration. I used to spend hours and hours exploring the land, just kind of hanging out with the cows and witnessing the land. And it was a really fun thing. And it was something I had forgotten about, I think, until I was doing some writing projects related to my studies here. And it was a really nice thing to rediscover. And as I rediscovered it, sort of nature started playing jokes on me and brought a bunch of cows for me to look at and spend time with. And so we'll look at that as part of my work. So my exhibit is called Interstices, and I've defined it here. It's a noun. It means to pause or to make a break or an intervening space. And I really like that concept of an intervening space. And one of the synonyms of interstice is mediate. And you think about conflict resolution and mediation, and I think about reflection. And really that's sort of the mission here with my work, if it has a mission, is to just cause a pause or a moment of reflection or reconsideration and try to reflect on the relationship that we have with nature. And I'm going to talk about reconciliation, but I really want to talk about it in a very positive light, not in a light that maybe villainizes humans. And so we'll talk about that as we go a little bit. So I want to talk about the Anthropocene because a lot of my work really revolves around this issue. And the Anthropocene is the geologic epoch that we're in, that where man has the greatest influence in nature. So we've theoretically, and maybe we're just really overconfident, but the idea of the Anthropocene is that we're the greatest force impacting the earth. And photography was there at the beginning of the Anthropocene. So this is a picture 16 milliseconds after it began on July 16th, 1945, which was the Trinity test in Los Alamos. And that was what is now considered to be the start of the Anthropocene, although we didn't know it now. And the reason it's called the start, or considered the start, is that from this nuclear testing, all these carbon isotopes that are very specific to the nuclear testing that didn't exist prior to it infiltrated the world. And every rock, the enamel in our teeth, everything has it. And these carbon isotopes are very specific to us. And so you can think about this one moment as the most powerful thing, because it should literally change the earth. And that's why we call this the start of the Anthropocene. Although it's important to recognize that the arc of human influence in the earth, and maybe not always positive influence, is much longer than the Anthropocene. in 1945. So an example of that would be whenever humans moved into a new area, and you're talking about like, Homo sapiens of 100,000 years ago, there was this great megafauna die-off that would happen every time a human moved somewhere. And so we've always had a kind of complicated relationship with nature as we're trying to make ourselves comfortable to live. So the other thing that's happened with the Anthropocene and with climate change is that our understanding of this has become very complex. And it started off really very simply, where we understood there was a connection between like acid rain and carbon emissions. And it's funny, this image is from the International Panel on Climate Change. And they assigned that relationship of carbon and rain to the mid 1970s. But I'm not that old, and I distinctly remember in school learning that that was the only connection of like the environment when I was in school, and it was probably like the 90s that I was learning that. So maybe it takes 20 years for that stuff to translate to. But anyway, one of the points of this, and the reason I'm showing this graphic, is that as we've gotten more complicated with or more complex or nuanced in our understanding of the climate and the environment, we've had to use a lot more sciences to understand it. And the word for that is methodologic pluralism. And this pluralism refers to the fact that you need biology, you need ecology, you need genetics, you need hydrogeology, you need chemistry, you need atmospheric sciences. All these things come together, and only by looking at the big, broad, whole scope can you really appreciate what's happening. And that's a thing that really appeals to me. It's almost how my brain thinks a little bit in terms of trying to understand a lot about a lot of things. And so I've tried to replicate or come up with my own version of this pluralism in my photography. One of the things before I go on here is that there's this interesting connection of psychological response to the environment. And philosophers and health professionals have begun assigning psychosocial or psycho-emotional conditions related to the environment. I have on the right side there the word solastalgia kind of elevated. And that's the one that really kind of hits me a little bit. Solastalgia is an emotion that's rooted to place. And it's different than nostalgia. Nostalgia is like, oh, I remember those like this toy I played with a long time ago, and you remember what was in a different place in your time. But solastalgia has to do with the earth changing around you, even if you never go anywhere. And so it might be like a very classic example would be if you lived in a very Arctic region and you fished in ice, and now there's no more ice, and you have to learn how to live differently. That emotion that you might have, that loss of place, is referred to as solastalgia. And I mean, I feel it a little bit even when I look back at that image of where I grew up and I see the solar panels or whatever black things are in that field that I can't figure out. I feel that's change in place. And I think giving us permission to have emotions relative to the environment or the environmental change is a really kind of a forward-thinking thing. And I think also ties into this pluralism. So there's this guy who's really good at mediation, John Paul Lederach, and he kind of has a statement that art in the creative process is crucial to resolving or helping to resolve conflict and building social capital, and that art really excels at reframing issues and symbol management and providing opportunities and communities to engage. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot with reconciliation. And on a broad level, it's repairing harms between groups and individuals. The process of reconciliation is very specific yet individualized. So everybody goes through kind of these same phases, but how you go through them and how you consider reconciliation is really an individualized process. It includes reflection, acknowledgement, negotiation, reparations, and more. And the reason I bring up this reconciliation is I don't think that my artwork can cause reconciliation. It would be fun if it did, but I as a human species, we're not there. But I just want to cause that reflection and the acknowledgement. And one of the things that really is an interesting point is there's an example of how reconciliation can be defined very differently. And the example is the Canadian government wanted to reconcile with Indigenous peoples in Canada. And so they sent out a survey crew and talked to them about reconciliation. And they came back and the survey crew was like, we're all wrong on this. And it turned out that what the Canadian government thought of as reconciliation was very different from what the Indigenous people thought of. And so the thing that was the most different was that the Indigenous people assigned a need to reconcile with non-living and non-human things, which you heard in my bio. And so things like waterways and rocks and mountains. And if you consider that, it's almost like a pluralism in how Indigenous people reconcile. And I think there's a lesson to be learned there in terms of not maybe how we should do this or they're right and we're wrong, but maybe a guide or a pathway forward to think about things and to cause that reflection. And, again, I just want to reiterate this, that, we're not criminals in this. And I think if you approach these issues with this idea that we're always doing something bad, then you don't get very far. And I think you need to give us permission to use some of the resources that we exploit and to live our comfy lives without being the criminals in this. And I think it just bears repeating. So if we get back to my work, I think one of the first things you notice when you see this exhibit is that as you go around, you see a lot of different bodies of work. And you see maybe there's 5 or 6 different bodies of work. And they look and they feel different. And to me, that's my methodologic pluralism, is trying to explore and gather data on these subjects in a way that doesn't look at it with just one lens, but I use different cameras. I have a bunch of different cameras that I use, and I, display things differently, and I repeat imagery. And together, this is my attempt at pluralism to understand the complex nature of what I'm looking at, which is, of course, nature. So I take some lead in photographic history. I had more photographic history slides, but a wise faculty member said that MFA talks are really boring if you include too much history because they kind of know it already. So we skipped that part. And here I'm including just some images where photographers have started responding to issues related to the Anthropocene. David Mizell does a lot of aerial photography really high up. And so he photographs a lot in Utah and the Great Salt Lake, and he's photographed Dugway Proving Grounds. Edward Burtynsky is sort of like the photographer of the Anthropocene. And so he's got these like images that showcase these really colorful things that are really kind of scary. Like if you dipped your toe in the lithium mine water, you'd have really quick antimony poisoning and not have a good day. And so, those two photographers kind of look at this like really ecological doom in a sense. But I'm also intrigued by photography by someone like Laura McPhee, who this image of the trees are from a book work that she has called Guardians of Solitude. And there's very beautiful photos, and then photos where there's been wildfires that were ravaging, which isn't necessarily separate from natural process, but perhaps in this case was. So I guess that photographic response to the Anthropocene is something that I've been drawing a lot of my inspiration from. So this image here is called Sequence to Darkness. And all of the images here were taken at or after sunset. And the images, there's like 5 black and white and 2 color images that kind of interrupt it. And they're almost, I call them almost abstractions. It's funny, I sent my work to a gallery to have mounted, and they came back and they were all like upside down and sideways because I think they were abstract enough that the gallery couldn't tell which way was up, which I thought was a success. And, but when you look a little closer at this, this series, you do start to see shapes and you start to understand a hint of thing that you're looking at. But for me, I guess presenting this in a way that was abstract, that presented nature in a way that caused you to question it and to not feel comfortable where you are. I think we have this kind of easy living in nature nowadays. We ride through the streets and we forget that we're in nature. And to me, that's what this series does, is it sort of like put you off balance a little bit and makes you really question, like, well, what part of nature is that? I haven't seen that one before. If you look up close, there's little things that you might be able to pull out. So the image on the left is of a beaver dam, and it's covered with snow a little bit. And I think it's fascinating because beavers are the animals that can impact nature or intervene with nature. I guess as much as we can, or the most besides us. But when they do it, it looks so different, right? It's made of chaos, even though there's some lines in it. They just have this chaotic like method to it. And it just looks so different from like the angular organized lines that humankind makes when we intervene with the environment. And this picture on the right is it's a photograph of reeds at sunset, and the light is hitting the reeds, and the water is like relatively dark compared to it. And to me, it's part of this like almost abstraction where the light is confusing you in terms of scale and what you're looking at, and just presenting nature in a way that maybe you hadn't considered yet before. So when I came to Salt Lake, I was immediately intrigued by this smelter. And I went to one of the first places I went was the Great Salt Lake State Park, and they have a signable plaque that has all the information about the smelter. And I became kind of obsessed with how tall it was. So the smelter, I don't know if you know this or not, if you're not from Salt Lake City and you're on the call, or if you are and haven't learned it, the smelter is the tallest building west of the Mississippi. So it's taller than all of the buildings in LA and San Francisco, which is kind of stunning. And it doesn't appear that way, perhaps because the mountains are so darn big next to it, that it kind of makes it a little bit small. But I started photographing the smelter and I couldn't stop. I just kept going back to it and repeating the imagery and looking at it over and over and over again. So this photo you see here is taken with an infrared camera, and it's one of the several cameras that I use. And what I like about the infrared is that there's no color in infrared, right? By definition, it's outside of the visible spectrum of colors. And so infrared photography then, therefore, is like at a pure level, you could define it as light values. And I think that's where the intrigue to me in this image comes in, is that the reflection is there, but it's not really a reflection. It's not the same thing that you see. The color of the mountain and the water is slightly different because it's cooler coming off of the water. So you're not getting the same reflection. And to me, it just allowed a very unique exploration of this area of the smelter. And so I took a bunch of photos of the smelter. Most of my preparation for my exhibition was eliminating photos of the smelter. So that would be I maybe spent a month eliminating photos. And the anchoring photo here I took with my 8x10 camera at sunrise, big view camera. And it's a very lonely place sometimes over there. And it's just, but the smelter is never quiet. There's always this smoke coming from it. There's always industrial process happening. And it happens outside of our field of vision, which is really kind of, I guess, indicative or representative of so many things with our industry and the things that support how we live our lives. And so by using repetition in my photography and by flying the drone, sometimes where I think maybe it could be possibly restricted airspace. I'm not really clear about it. I'm almost like subverting this process of going through our lives without seeing these places and things that support what we do. I mean, they're making copper here, and copper is everywhere, right? It's in our computers and our electrical lines, but you don't really get that in-depth tour of the smelter as part of your life human experience. So this is another detail photo of sort of the repetition and the exploration that I like to do. And I guess to me, like, this repetition is almost rooted in like my scientific basis. And it's like experimenting, it's repeating experiments, it's gathering data from multiple viewpoints to understand and help share what I'm witnessing with everybody who looks at my photographs. With this one, this is another 8x10 photo. It's of the Marathon Refinery in North Salt Lake. And one of the reasons I included this in the exhibition, is that the sky is so beautiful next to it. And if you look close at the photo, if you're seeing it in person, it's a little easier, but there's a mountain range in the background. You can see a little bit of Antelope Island in the background. And so you have this insertion of nature alongside this thing that's really the opposite of nature, or built purely to extract and exploit nature. And I think seeing these things together and trying to combine something beautiful with something that's maybe scary and not beautiful, and that you try to turn your eyes away from as you drive past it. To me, it's part of this reconciliatory process of seeing these things together and having that be an okay thing. Same thing with landscape lines. It's another sequence, and in this sequence, I kind of have taken photos that are more in the style of grand landscapes, and maybe it's a little bit of like turning my nose up at like Instagram culture of these like beautiful, hyper saturated landscapes, and I'm trying purposely to not remove the power lines and almost reinsert the power lines into your view. Our brains are really magical, and we see things that matter to us most, and power lines rarely matter to us. And so I think it's funny that you can look at a landscape like either of these two landscapes, and if I asked you to describe it to me, you would probably describe what the landscape looked like, and you would never be able to tell me what the power lines looked like. But they're so critical to our existence, right? So they should maybe matter more, but they don't. So reimagining how we view landscape photography with these lines inserted into them is sort of the purpose here. And it's, again, to elevate the things that we don't see that are part of climate change and are part of how we use the earth and how we live with the earth around us, but maybe is very convenient for us to not see. So the next bit is about the magnesium factory. And this photograph here is the main stack of the magnesium plant. And I just want to tell you a little bit about that. The main stack is actually 6 smaller smokestacks. And so different materials come out of each of them. But the primary material that comes out of it is chlorine gas. And there's various levels that come out on any given day. But there's been as much as 100,000 tons of chlorine gas in a 24-hour period that comes out of this plant. And I don't know if you can tell if you're from the area or you know the geography or the directionality, that chlorine gas is heading right towards the city, right towards Salt Lake City, across the lake. The magnesium plant is the only magnesium producing area or factory in the United States. And so it's kind of a protected little space because of that. And it actually really impacts the global market for a lot of things because of it. It's surrounded by managed lands, so BLM lands, but even though it's surrounded by them, there's a law that rangers or BLM employees can't go within 5 miles of this smokestack and this plant. And it's not because there's secrets that they'll see or anything like that. It's because a bunch of rangers almost died one day when the wind turned, and all it did was blow the chlorine gas in the wrong direction, and they had a medical emergency. And so even as I'm here taking this photo, it's like anxiety producing, because I'm looking at the smokestack and hoping that the wind doesn't do like a weird swirly thing, and I am like enveloped with chlorine. And so it's a scary looking thing, but at the same time, when you get up and you look at it from a different angle, the magnesium plant becomes kind of magical. And this is a sequence of abstractions taken at different scales of the magnesium plant. And these are printed on, they're dye sublimation prints on aluminum. And the aluminum, I spent a while sourcing the aluminum, and I was able to be this like pain in the butt guy who would call up these weird aluminum suppliers and talk about my photography with them. But I was able to trace back the source of the aluminum, and these are recycled aluminum, and the alloy, the specific alloy that it is, was strengthened by the magnesium that was produced in this specific plant. So in a way, they are pictures of what they are of, which kind of is a thing that's important to me. Magnesium is a metal that is really useful to us. So, it's in our, it's in the computers, it's in the cement guys that did my driveway last week. Their tools are made with magnesium. So when I talked about the fact that I was doing magnesium photos to the cement guys, they got really roughed up right away because they thought I was like against magnesium, but I'm not against magnesium. I think it's a really important thing, and sort of transmutating like the beauty of these photos with sort of the horrible substances that are involved with the process of creating magnesium is sort of the point of this, and it calls you to try to reconcile with yourself about what you think about these photos. The one on the bottom left in particular, as you look at that, it's like this weird slag pile they have there, and it's just like solid waste products. And when you get really close, you see there's also barrels and pallets and a whole bunch of like industrial detritus that's in it, which all combine to make this magnesium plant the single most polluted Superfund site in the United States. And so it is legitimately horrible things that have happened to the environment. But yet somehow when you look at it this way and you see nature kind of reflected in the photos, and you see birds walking across some of the areas of these photos, it makes you consider it a different way. I also have a piece of magnesium. So here is just a piece of pure magnesium, and it's just striking to me. It's so pure and white and kind of like bright and clean looking. It's hard for my brain to connect that piece of magnesium to what we're seeing here. Here's some installation shots of these. They're 60-inch prints, so they're fairly large prints. And as you walk around them, you get to see the kind of light change a little bit with them, which is very similar to how they look in real life. Depending on the angle that you're looking at these things, they look very different in color and in their reflectivity. Here's another detail shot of one of the prints, and there's just these weird patterns, and it's hard to look at this and understand this isn't some abstract painting, but this is really what happened to the dirt when the chemicals related to the magnesium were placed upon it. So I'm going to move on from the magnesium, and I want to talk about cows for a bit. A whole one wall of my exhibition is about cows. And this photo is of the area where I took all of the cow photos. So all of the cow photos live inside of this area called Skull Valley, which is sort of a loaded area in the West Desert, west of Salt Lake City. In this photo, it's entitled Skull Valley with Feedlot. Later on, you'll see a grid of a feedlot. That feedlot is this kind of dark line on the horizon. So it's a really, really big area. It's BLM lands. It's got some weird history. There's, the Donner Party got stuck in ditches along the way there. There was a really bad social experiment with Polynesian refugees or immigrants in the early 1900s in this valley. It's got an indigenous history, and it's got a really interesting geothermic history too, where there's this brackish spring collection that pops up all over the place. And so cattle roam freely on it. Weird things like pronghorn antelope roam on it. It's really a fascinating area, but it's notably rugged and almost impossible for humans to live on from the land. But these cows, cows are kind of magical. They can eat the scrub and nothing of the desert and turn it into this huge collection of muscle. And we don't necessarily celebrate that magical gift that cows have often. But this cow wall is, this is where it gets, I guess, a little emotional for me, because I didn't anticipate encountering the cows the way I encountered them, but they were there. And so I witnessed them, and I felt like I had to share what I was witnessing. And on the bottom left, you see a cow that looks at first maybe like it's sleeping. Somebody that looked at it asked what the cow was munching on, but the cow was munching on the remnants of a motor vehicle collision that left it deceased. And so I took repeated images of the cow with different cameras, different lenses, different filters on the infrared camera, And so over a 3-week time period, and one of the interesting things about this cow that was laying there dead just off the side of the road is that nobody cared. Like, it was just this dead thing and nobody stopped. Nobody was going to pick it up. And for some reason, I guess the climate in the desert, I'm not versed enough in it yet, but the cow wasn't like disintegrating, and there was no vultures, and I didn't understand it. And so I had to keep going back to the cow and looking at it, and trying to understand it. And so, the wall has these images of these cows that have expired, and I think they're a little bit difficult to look at. Although I would note that as you walk through a grocery store, people don't tend to have emotional responses to meat counters. I think some people probably do, but for the most part, we don't look at them. We don't feel a meat counter. But when you see it connected to the cow, it becomes a different thing. The other thing you see in this wall is cows looking at you. I took a lot of photos of the cows, with almost my attempt to give them some agency, although that's kind of technically impossible because they didn't sign a permission form or they didn't talk to me about it. But I think the cows kind of confronting you with their gaze and confronting you in the various aspects of their life. So there's mothers and there's babies. And then, there's other weird things like the cow in the bottom of these 3 images here. It's got a weird sort of like tumor hanging from its face. And so, you wonder about the land that it's on that has a history of like really scary things happening at it. Who knows where that tumor came from? But I tried to convey the experience that cows are having, where they're at one side commodified as a resource to the point that we don't even care when they die. We don't even pick them up or even think about them, to the other side of the spectrum where these cows have lives and their mothers and their babies, and they're doing interesting things like playing in the mud, and trying to look at that together, the experience of the cow. On the one side of the wall is this one. I call it attempt and subsequent failed birth, unrealized twins. So this poor cow I came across while it was in labor, and I could tell that it had breech birth happening, and I tried to find help for it. I didn't know what to do. I was out in the middle of nowhere. It was maybe an hour from any road. And, this cow was struggling, and one twin had come out and was not alive. And the other one was stuck in the mother, and you could see all 4 limbs trying to come out at the same time. And so I tried to get help for it. I took some photographs and went and tried to find help. And it was almost impossible to find help. I ended up communicating to 4 different people, only one of which was a representative of the ranch that it came from, and it was just a kid. And their response was like, "Oh yeah, that's one of ours," and that was it. And it's like you're in a different world, right? And this poor mother was having this hard time, and there was nothing I could do about it. And so I went back because when I first encountered this mother. And you can see it in the middle photo here where her leg is extended. If you were looking really close or you're at the exhibit, you could see there was only one twin there. The other twin has legs coming out. And so this is the mother alive, and the rest of it was after. And so I revisited the mother after because it bothered me all week. I couldn't figure out what was going to have happened to her. And I had a lot of guilt about leaving her, but also this like conflict about, well, this is like nature happening. But, is it normal for cows to have twins? I had so many questions. And it turned out she probably didn't get saved because when cows have twins, they're usually not viable from like a farm standpoint. They usually have genetic defects or they can't reproduce or they won't grow fully. And I think given the lack of pigment in these cows, the calves were probably never alive. So this poor mother was doomed. This is part of me witnessing this event. And you can see the mother is alive here, and she's just stuck and hanging out, and I didn't know how to help her. And she was alert enough that I was afraid to walk by her because cows can kick pretty hard. And this was a thing that really kind of shook me a little bit. And I was afraid to look at her. I didn't want to know this cow. And I didn't go look at the cow's face until I went back the week later. And a week later, I was going through all these things in my head, like what could have happened to the cow? Could she still be alive there suffering? Could I have overreacted? Was I a city slicker? And the cow got up and walked away with its twins and everything was good. And when I went back, it wasn't good. It was a bad time. And to me, this trench that she dug with her feet is kind of haunting. And then I contrasted this with the cow that had gotten hit by the car and had this really quick death. And it looks so peaceful that it looks like it's sleeping or playing with the mirror. And then this cow doesn't look peaceful at all. And so it was really notable to me that the deaths of these two cows could be so different, yet they were equally forgotten. Nobody's going to pick up either of these cows. Like they're just kind of like an afterthought of the ranchers who owned them, which to me is sort of the take home about this in terms of considering how we think about non-human things. So, I know that was maybe like a little bit of a downer, but I want to leave with this photo. This is storm clouds over mine tailings. This is again near the smelter. And to me, this is representative of an ongoing negotiation with the planet that we're having, where at the top, you see this really powerful storm cloud forming. Almost looks like a mushroom cloud, like a nuclear cloud. So it kind of reminds you of that a little bit. But then you have this huge mountain that's an artificial mountain just made of leftovers of the mine. And that's representative of the things that we create and the power that we have as humans. And so this ongoing negotiation is, I think, kind of the contemplative thought that I'd like the collective body of my work to leave people with, if I could be so presumptuous that they would think about that for that long. But so that's where I think. And then, I would like to thank everybody for listening, and I have many minutes for questions if you have them. And these cows probably also thank you for paying attention to them.
Thank you, Eric. I think we would like to open it up for questions. If you would like to either put something in the chat or unmute yourself and ask a question, or raise your hand, whatever feels the most comfortable. But yeah, we have time for questions.
And by chance, if anybody is watching this on YouTube, you can go ahead and type a chat in there, and I'll go ahead and read those to Eric.
Eric, I have a question.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you. This was very interesting. And I obviously know a lot about your work because I've worked with you now over the course of this year. But I really appreciated some of the background and some of the context you gave. And anyhow, so I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about sort of your journey over the course of your time at the U. And I want to hear if you can talk about the arc of change that has occurred both in your work and your thinking during the past year.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that really easy question. So, I think when I came here, I was very scattered, and I didn't have a conceptual line that I was following in my photography. I was sort of still trying to calibrate what were good photos and what weren't good photos. And part of the reason I did this MFA was to understand how conceptual art differed from good photography. And I still hadn't gotten there yet when I came here. And as I started going through the year, I think circumstances put me in this spot where I was alone exploring in these new places and responding to this new place. And, the pandemic did some of that, and just kind of my own kind of getting more comfortable with going and doing that. And so as I did that, I started to realize like the things that were more important to me that I was thinking about a lot. And then I would say that there was a kind of a breakthrough moment where I was giving, I think, like an intermediary like update to my committee, and I wrote a bunch of stuff down and I gave it to them, and they were like, "Oh, okay, now we see how you're thinking." And I was like, "Oh, this is a communication thing." And so I started to really embrace what is a very natural thing for me, which is when I encounter something new, I research as much about it as I can, and I consume more about it than probably most people can or do or have the patience for, or maybe aren't as crazy as me. And I think that really influences my photography quite a bit. So like, for example, when I went to image the magnesium plant, I read the Superfunds report. It was like a 9,000 page report. I didn't read every page of it, but I found all these cool models in it and I learned all these things from it. And it really taught me a bunch. And then the other thing is that I started learning that as I witnessed things and I needed to learn more about them, I revisited the areas that I was going. And that became part of my process. And it dawned on me today as I was thinking about this talk that almost none of my images occurred from the first time I visited someplace. They were all repeat visits where I like learned more about it, then learned more about it. And then I felt like I could communicate about it from a visual standpoint. And then at the end of the day, I think the arc of connecting that with this issue of reconciliation and the environment, it was something I think about all the time, how we interact with our environment. I think that connection for me really set me on a path where I felt like I had a voice of something to say.
Thank you.
I'll just launch in, Eric. I really enjoyed hearing more about your work and your talk. And I'm not entirely sure how to phrase this. Is there something about the point of view, the perspective, the distance in a drone image that changes how we see information? I mean, do you have any thoughts? I mean, beyond just sort of the visual point of view, it seems to give me a different, we'll say, perspective on things. Do you have a sense of what that typically is and maybe why and how that happens?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. I had a friend was viewing the art the other day in the exhibition, and the one photo I took of the mother and the unrealized twins, it's a drone photograph, but I took it from like maybe 1 meter high. So it was like absolutely the lowest drone photograph I could ever take. And when this friend looked at the art, she said, boy, like, even if I stumbled across that, I wouldn't have that perspective of it. And that's like the least exciting drone photograph because it's like just right over there. And that's different than when I flew it as high as the drone would go and I was afraid it was going to melt over the top of the smelter. So I think getting in an aerial view is a very unique perspective because it's just not how we see the earth. It's just not how we're wired to view things. It's just playing a trick with our brain a little bit and things become very two-dimensional. And you get to see different sides or the relationships of things, one thing to another. When I was younger, my dad is a pilot and we would fly all over the country, all over to different places. We used to go to a lot of air shows and it was very boring sitting in a plane when you're a little kid. So I would sit with the maps on my lap and I would look outside and I spent hours and hours just staring down from an aerial viewpoint. I kind of wonder in the same way that I like kind of hanging out with the cows a little bit, if there's, something that's built deep in me that has to do with looking down and seeing perspectives from that angle.
Thank you.
Eric, I have a question about this idea of reconciliation, specifically how this work has, from what it sounds like, and of course, having many conversations with you about your work, it seems like your feelings about reconciliation have maybe not fully been formed, but been formed and shifted as a result of making this work. For example, one thing that you talked about that has really resonated with me is, the sort of cow stories that you've shared, particularly this idea that you felt this desire to like find somebody to help this mother cow who was dying, right? And when you found somebody, it seemed like no one cared. And so for me, that brings up lots of questions around like capitalism and non-human animals and commodity. And I'm just sort of curious about how your relationship has been formed and thinking about reconciliation through this work specifically. If maybe you could touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, and I wouldn't presume that I'm an expert at reconciliation in any way, right? And I think what you said about my view of it is still forming. I have a family member who has a degree in conflict resolution, and so I went and run into them, and I had them look at my stuff and try to teach me a little bit about reconciliation. And I've been reading as much as I can. And for me, it's brought up some like questions internally, which maybe is the thing I want to talk about, which is, when I'm hanging out with these cows, I still will go home and I'm not a vegan and I'm not a vegetarian and I still eat these things, but it's like causing some like conflict in me about my own personal choices. And maybe I can answer another question here at the same time, because I see Bryce's chat. Is conflict the goal of your work, or do you seek motivation to change from the viewer? And I don't think conflict is the goal of my work, not at all. I think reflection is the goal of my work. But as part of that reflection, if action happens, then it happens. But for me, this reconciliation, it's the thing that I learned that really is so interesting is how individualized it is. And I'm not assuming that we all reconcile with the environment, but if we all can start to contemplate it and just to pay attention to more parts of it, I feel like there's maybe something in us that becomes kind of a beneficial change moment or something. But and I don't necessarily think my work is advocacy, but it's not advocacy. So I guess those are the things I have to say about that.
Thank you. I have another question.
Yeah. Go for
So
it.
Ed asked about the drone, and you sort of talked about that, but something else that you spoke to, and so I guess this is sort of a little bit of a twofold question, is you talked about the different cameras that you use, the different sort of mediums within photography, and then you also talked about the materials and the role that they played. So for example, the aluminum prints, right? And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about your decision, which we could say is maybe a technical decision about why you might shoot with an 8x10 versus a drone versus a DSLR, right? But in your work, there seems to be a connection, which I think is really important, to like the reason you selected a camera, the thing that you were photographing, and why that connection is important. So it doesn't seem like necessarily like this, that you were, an afterthought, or you were just thinking like, oh, I just want to shoot this with 8x10. Like that feels like, in the way that you've talked about it, a cognizant decision, that you're like interested in thinking about the form in terms of concept. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah. So, it's interesting that you brought up the materials. One of the things I wanted to bring up, that I didn't have a chance to tell anybody yet, was that all of the cow photos are printed on hemp-based paper. So I wanted to like get as organic as I could with the paper choice there. Kind of also understanding that your camera is built up of all these extracted metals anyway. But for me, choosing the form of the camera kind of it does matter, and it's something I think about quite a bit. So I went and I viewed maybe that cow that had died with my just digital camera. And I felt like I wasn't understanding the whole perspective. And so I needed the drone to go back and to see the full perspective. And I could see the feedlot from the road, but I didn't understand the feedlot. And so I needed the drone to get a different perspective of that. And when I'm choosing the 8x10 camera, if you notice, a lot of the 8x10 photos are of things that are really industrial. But it's that industrial sort of nature mix. And to me, I guess it harkens back to who used the 8x10 camera, which were like all these traditional landscape photographers. And there's like the classic image of like Ansel Adams riding around like beautiful Yosemite, shooting from the top of his like station wagon or whatever wood paneled mobile he had, shooting these really pristine landscapes. And I'm not shooting that, but I'm using the same equipment. And I think that there's something to be said there about reconsideration of the environment, using the same lens. And I feel a little Ansel Adamsy when I shoot from the back of my truck, but I don't have cool wood panels.
And I was going to say, speaking of animals, the cow series, do you want to talk a little bit more? Because that seemed to have a very different, well, not very different, but sort of a different direction. I mean, was it the subject matter? What was some of your responses? Because there's something that starts to feel really personal about that. I mean, the landscapes can feel fairly abstract, but there's sort of this, what? I feel like I'm feeling more of you in some respects. And is it just from the subject matter, do you think? Or
it's it might just be, what I think about cows. I've always I remember used to ride my bike all around northern New Jersey, and it was a really beautiful area. And there's a lot of cows that live there. And I would always joke to my friends that cows had the most beautiful eyes of the whole animal kingdom. Like they have these really nice long eyelashes, but that's a weird thing to say. But I always have felt a compassion for cows. And maybe that's why I chose them as a subject matter to convey this exploitation, because they are so abused in our industrial processes and in our food chain. And when I see the mother cow with its baby, or even when I look at these 3 cows here on the screen, they're just enjoying their life. They're just hanging out, they're doing cool stuff. And I feel maybe I'm personifying them more than they deserve, or more than they would ever be aware of in their own mind, but I don't know. And I feel because they're living beings, there's naturally an affinity for me to bond with them a little bit. So the magnesium, it's always just going to be this chunk of magnesium. And, on a spectrum, I probably put magnesium on one end, and maybe reptiles and birds, and then mammals, right? Because I have trouble relating to reptiles, but there's this humanity in the cows that I feel, and that I tried to depict in their portraits.
I mean, it just kind of seems like, the cow shots are maybe the closest kind of things, the most, personal. And then, the farthest away are the extreme drones. Do you think it's sort of subject matter, or just point of view? Distance physically makes sort of a distance emotionally?
Yeah, maybe a little, but not so much. I think part of the distance in the abstractions and the magnesium things is as I required, they technically required that distance to see patterns and to really kind of understand what was happening there. But I guess it's more of, to me, it would be more of the mammalian kind of bond at a deep level that we have with these creatures that we share the planet with.
I think we have time for one more question.
Ed kind of took my question. But I mean, it's somebody, I've worked with Eric since he got to campus here, to the U. And I can see the work you did with me last semester in the photos of the cows. So I'm going to say that to kind of follow up on Ed's question there. I understand this abstraction that you're doing with the cows and the closeness you were doing with nature. But I really just wanted to say too that your work really is reminiscent of the new topographic photographers from the 70s, where you're just indexing what is there within nature, not really commenting, but forcing us to make our own responses to what we're seeing. So it's not really a question, just a statement.
Yeah, well, I would say that there was some intention with that, especially with the untitled sequence about the smelter, where I kind of put some white borders on the photos. There's the only photos in the whole exhibition really that have these big white borders on them, and the new topographics photographs were matted, framed 8x10 photos, and so those are 8x10 kind of matted, not framed, because I had to rebel a little bit, but that was maybe a hat tip to that photographic period or work.
Okay, thank you so much, Eric. That was a really wonderful lecture. If everyone would join me in congratulating Eric on such a great talk. And please make sure that you go and see the show. It is open until next Friday, the 7th. Again, Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. It's really great, so please go check it out.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Appreciate it.
Nice work, Eric.
Thank you.
Great work, Eric.